video games have a long-standing history of providing multiple endings. Regardless of how they are implemented, they allow the player to feel as though their actions have meaning, that the way we play and the choices we make have a lasting influence on the game world. As an entertainment medium, this is the dividing line between video games and other forms of art. In film and books, the audience is a passive observer, sitting back and simply watching the story unfold. The emotions and opinions of the audience play no role in how the story plays out. Games, on the other hand, allow the player to be directly involved, whether the hero succeeds or fails, or how the protagonist and other characters grow and change. Whether these changes are good or bad, well, they entirely fall onto our shoulders. Games include various different methods of tracking choices. Silent Hill, for example, tracks how many monsters you slay, the time it takes to finish the story, how many times the player saved, and even small details like if you looked at a certain item in the pause menu. More commonly, we see binary choice systems that create branching paths. Usually, the choices themselves don't change much other than trivial features in the game world, but after replaying one game, I can see how these binary choices had long-lasting consequences, not just for the world, but for the development of a character's entire moral system. Bioshock 2 sits in an odd place in the trilogy. While each game in the series has its virtues, in my opinion, our second excursion to the bottom of the ocean does one primary thing better than the others: theming. The theming throughout Bioshock 2 is thick and pervasive throughout the narrative. Fatherhood. More specifically, the archetype of the father. Between the side story of Mark Meltzer searching for his lost daughter to the relationship between Delta and Eleanor, we see various forms of this dynamic at play. On top of this, the theme directly plays into how the multiple endings are formed based upon player choice. The purpose of this video is to first detail how the archetype expresses itself throughout the narrative, then to break down why the choice system and the multiple endings relate to this theme as well. Let's start at the beginning. The father archetype summons various images to mind: a teacher, authority, law, discipline, and order. This expresses itself in both positive and negative ways. A righteous and benevolent leader versus a power-hungry tyrant. Both are expressions of authority. While it is easy to see these as opposite aspects, we must perceive them as being rooted in the same thing. If we strip away all expressions of the father archetype, what we are left with is one simple structure. The father is a filter through which the child archetype sees the world. It acts as a lens through which we learn about life, morality, and how to deal with hardship. Various people in our lives act in this role. Not only our parents, but also teachers, religious leaders, and mentors. Anyone can be a conduit for this archetype, as long as he or she acts in this capacity for us. We look to them to learn when we are lost and seeking guidance. As I mentioned earlier, those that fill this role can be benevolent, but some abuse this position and spread falsehood to gain power. The archetype itself can be seen in both sides of the coin. In simpler terms, the father archetype acts as a model, whether it be a positive or negative one. In this context, model is defined as a system or thing used as an example to follow or imitate. It is why many theological systems have their own version of the enlightened or perfect being. These include figures like the Buddha, Krishna, or Jesus Christ. The title of father is even given to some leaders in religious communities. Most of the time, however, we attempt to emulate models of a different type: actors, community leaders, fictional characters, etc. If we are not careful, a corrupted father archetype can lead one down dark paths. One example in recent games may be Odin from God of War Ragnarok. When his vision for the world is a mandate upon those who follow him, the tyrannical father comes into play. For more on this topic, I'll link out my God of War video that deals with this theme. In Bioshock, we see this same dynamic play out with Andrew Ryan, Father Comstock, and for the purposes of this video, Dr. Sophia Lamb. Without getting too much into her backstory or philosophy, we can boil her position down to this: she resonates with the tyrannical father while imprisoned in Persephone, converting the inmate population to her belief system and eventually taking control of the prison. Lamb gave them an ideology to live by, which gave her control over them. From here, another character takes her philosophy and runs with it. Father Simon Wales takes the collective model that was preached by Lamb, inserts religious symbolism into it, then creates a cult centered around inducting more of the survivors of Rapture into the family. Cult leaders are perfect examples of the corrupted father. They induct new members into their worldview, who are then emotionally manipulated or threatened into never leaving. Hence the expression, tyrannical father.
She constantly reminds me that I was born for the express purpose of promoting her ideals.
With this as the backdrop of the story, we assume the role of Johnny Topside, aka Subject Delta. He is named after the Greek letter which represents change and variations. It is a prism through which one thing is transformed into another, just like the child is filtered through the threshold guardian that is the father archetype, and is transformed into psychological adulthood. At some point in the history of Rapture, the daughter of Dr. Lamb is converted into a little sister and bonded with Subject Delta. This creates a father-child relationship. At this point, it is only the role of protector that Delta engages with. After discovering what happened to her daughter, Dr. Lamb tracked the two down and through use of psychological programming, forced him to end himself. Over the years since the loss of her bonded father, Elanor was being prepared by her mother to become a holy vessel for the cult to worship. Rebelling against this plan, Elanor used her mental link with the other little sisters to locate Delta's body and take a gene sample. Using the Vita Chamber, she manages to bring back the man that she considers her father. From that point forward, the plot of Bioshock 2 proceeds. This brings us to the point of the multiple endings and the role of the father archetype from Eleanor Lamb's perspective. The girl rebels against her mother's philosophy of society. By running from one model of society, Elanor must inevitably replace it with something else. Looking to Delta, his and by extension our actions act as a new model of morality. Instead of being delegated to a protector, Delta takes on the role of the spiritual teacher and father. Throughout the game, Delta is presented with several choices. All of them come down to the player's perception on morality. By observing Delta, Elanor learns the player's morality. The various endings showcase what she learns from us during our run-through, for the good or for the bad. One of many roles the parent has in the child's life is to teach and raise them. More often than not, the child learns more from observing their parents' behaviors rather than listen to their words. If instructed to eat their vegetables by a parent who refuses to do so themselves, the kid notices and behaves accordingly. It is the moral responsibility of anyone raising a child to act out the same morality and virtues that they hope to instill upon the next generation. Some believe they will be great parents, but through poor behavior on their part, they become a negative model that the child will sometimes emulate, taking the wrong lesson as the child develops into adulthood. Earlier, I mentioned multiple expressions of this archetype in society. Teachers, religious leaders, film, and various other sources will present models for emulation as well. With all of the conflicting images, the child will generally settle on one of these and ignore the others that conflict with it, just like Elanor was raised by her mother's worldview but eventually rebelled against it, turning to Delta, a different father archetype, for something to replace it with. If one does not know what triggers the different endings, we are likely not thinking about how our actions will impact Elanor. She's watching everything we do, taking notes, learning about how our sense of morality works so that by the end, she can emulate it. The player becomes the model that Elanor learns from. We literally become the father archetype for her. The question is, are we a good role model or a bad one?
You know why Eleanor brought you here? She wanted a father. So she found a way to restore you in body and mind. And she has been watching you ever since, exalting your every act as gospel.
Mother was right about one thing. I have been watching you, Father, studying the way you have treated others, and now I know who I am.
4 choices are presented to the player, each of which is important to which ending we get. The ultimate fate of Grace Holloway, Stanley Poole, and Gilbert Alexander are up to Delta. All of them have either done terrible things to Delta and Elanor, or exist in a state of madness that makes them a danger to everyone. As a result, Delta has good reason to kill them. What we do, however, is witnessed by Elanor, and she will take upon herself the morality of our decision. The final of the 4 decisions is whether we save or harvest the little sisters. Unlike the others, they are 100% victims. Saving them shows Elanor that the innocent should be protected. Harvesting them tells her that anything can be sacrificed if it means personal empowerment or survival. While playing, most of us don't consider how our actions will affect our bonded child. We only see the gameplay utility of harvesting versus saving the little sisters, or flirt with moral relativism when deciding who gets to live and die. Ultimately, Elanor is the one most affected by these choices. By the end, we see her sense of morality change radically to match how we behaved during the aforementioned choices. Let's listen to a couple of her final dialogues for an idea.
And then, Father, the rapture dream was over. You taught me that evil is just a word. Under the skin, it's simple pain. For you, mercy was victory. You sacrificed, you endured, and when given the chance, you forgave. Always. Mother believed this world was irredeemable, but she was wrong, Father. We are Utopia, you and I, and in forgiving, we left the door open for her. You taught me that justice is a contract. Once broken, it can never be mended. You sacrificed so much to preserve the innocent, but to the guilty, you offered no mercy. I loved my mother, and I never wanted to hurt her. But with what she did to us, she gave up the right to exist. My hands were shaking when I did it, but you were there to steady them. You taught me that right and wrong are tidal forces, ever shifting. To survive in rapture, Father, you took what you needed from the innocent. But when the guilty posed no further threat, you simply walked away. I wanted Mother dead. But broken as she was, how could she hurt me? Now, she will grow old and die, knowing that I rejected her. You taught me that innocence is chrysalis, a phase designed to end. Only when we are free from it do we know ourselves. You showed me that my survival, my joy, are all that matter. I indulge. Nothing else exists.
Based upon what lesson she learns, Elanor will either save her mother or kill her. But what she learns has ramifications that go beyond Dr. Lamb's ultimate fate. These lessons will be taken forward into how she engages with the surface world. Does she consider any form of innocence a bad thing, or something to be preserved? Does she engage in mercy or retribution for those who have wronged her? Does she have a solid moral framework, or does morality change to fit her current needs? Does she believe her own whims are more important than the suffering of others? By playing the game and acting as the archetypal father for Elanor, we show her a model of behavior which shapes her belief on these questions. If we act without thinking about how we will be perceived by those who look up to us, they may learn the wrong lesson. But it takes two for this relationship to function. As children develop into psychological adulthood, they will learn to make their own decisions. Do they accept the lessons of those who came before, or reject it and proceed into the world without it? This is reflected in Eleanor's final choice. Does she take the atom from Delta and inject it into herself, or does she reframe and leave behind everything that he was? Part of Bioshock 2's story involves Dr. Lamb's plan to use Elanor for her new utopian project. She believed that the self and individual identity was the problem. Through atom infusion, she could fill the collective minds and genius of the people into her child, in essence, suppressing the girl's sense of self so that her mind was only a collective. Elanor rebelled in order to preserve her individuality. Some endings allow this choice to be made: accept Delta's Adam, or reject it. If she does, she takes within herself everything that he was, genetically placing him on her shoulder like a guardian angel to guide her when she feels lost. Or does she reject the Adam transfusion, denying everything she learned from him and forging her own path? Does she accept the worldview of what came before as a foundation to build upon, or does she turn her back on it completely? Depending on what she learned from Delta, an argument can be made for both. If we learn negative things from an expression of this archetype, rejecting it is prudent. If we learn positive things, accepting it is beneficial. But which is which? How do we distinguish between what is ultimately positive or negative? Not just for ourselves, but for our family, our community, or the world as a whole. This is something for the philosophers, and comes with life experience and wisdom. Even then, it is hard to tell. All we can hope for is to be the best role models we can for the next generation, and hope that everything works for the best. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, please drop a like and subscribe to receive updates on future uploads. If you would like to help support the channel, a Patreon has been set up and the link is in the description below. Have a great day and peace be with you all.